Langan is my married name. I was born in Scotland of Irish origin and have lived in London for much of my life also, so I have an English accent now. Have also lived in Canada and the Netherlands for the last 15 years.
You travel back and forth?
No, I have lived in Canada and for the last 15 years I'm living in the Netherlands. I'm married to a Dutchman.
Were you working when you arrived in Holland?
For the first 9 months that I had decided to make it my permanent home, I travelled back and forth from London. I worked 3 days a week in London and the rest of the time I was in Amsterdam. And I worked as a project manager in London. Did that at first and then finally decided A, that was exhausting, B, I needed to commit to here. And so then came here full time. Looking back on it, I would do it differently if I did it again.
What would you have done?
I think coming from London, I would suggest getting a headhunter if you're going to come and find something in Amsterdam, particularly where I live, because I think there are lots of opportunities, but getting those connections when you first come is difficult unless you have a really good network. Having lived here for quite some time, I understand that the Dutch attitude to expats is that they're tolerant of them not speaking Dutch for the first 2 years, and after that they may not express it, but they're pretty annoyed if they haven't made an effort after that. And I think you get a different sense of the culture. You understand it totally differently once you understand their language, because you get a much more integrated sense of their culture. But of course it depends how long you're here for. You can get away with it, certainly in Amsterdam and The Hague, if you're only here for a year. It's an interesting one though, because I've now reached the point, having been here for 15 years, that I now have decided to speak a bit more English. So I've come a little bit circle with it, partly because that helps me feel a little bit more myself in some ways.
What kind of work do you do here now?
I have my own business which is called S Space, and I work with coaching for business and for families and individuals, and I also work with feng shui, some people call it. So I try to help people realize their dreams and goals.
And do you consider Dutch people business people, or?
Well, I think they're extremely paradoxical culture.
Can you give an example of how you come across that impression?
Well, I think they are very businesslike, and the bottom line and money is quite important to Dutch people, and they are extremely practical people. I think they're the most practical people I've ever come across anywhere.
What's an
in the
example
world.
of a practical decision or practical activity?
Well, they're practical in the sense that they will be aim to achieve things with spending as little as possible. So you have to be always aware of that with Dutch people. And I think many Dutch women display this in everyday activities. And I, for example, don't need in the supermarket to look at the prices because everybody else does. So I know I'm getting generally good value.
Okay. Any other practical? You said they were paradoxical, and I don't know if I cut you off, but
yeah.
Well, on the one hand, they're practical.
I guess the birth process is probably the most practical example one can describe in Holland. Of course, they're well known for the fact, maybe a lot of foreigners don't know this, but for the fact that they rarely use any chemicals in the birth process. So everything is natural. That means painful, normally. So they're very practical from that point of view, and their hardiness, enormous hardiness. And I remember in the first year of living in Holland thinking many, many times, these people will not be defeated in a certain way. I remember thinking they were occupied during the war, but at some level the Germans never defeated them internally. I always have that sense about them, and that's to do with their sturdiness, their solidness. And the birth process, I think, would be the clearest example of that. Having gone through it myself, and actually, in a way, I feel very proud of having done so. That, of course, is very different to the States or to Spain, where obviously to numb the pain is often very much the high priority. In Holland, it's very much experience this.
And did you take sedatives, or you went for the Dutch experience?
I went for the Dutch experience and survived it.
Is there anything that's really shockingly different about the medical culture for women who are pregnant and maybe having to come and have children here that's really important to either understand what that really means or that they might have to prepare for?
I think a number of things will be shocking, yes. For me, the greatest shock was originally having intended to have a baby at home, ending up in the hospital for medical reasons, having the baby, which went well, but obviously it was a huge experience, asking just after the birth what happens now, and the nurse explained to me that they would just give me a shower and let me go home within 3 hours. Right, so that was a shock. Yeah.
Wow. Any other shocking things? Wow, that's important information.
Yeah, I think basically the fact that when you go to the doctor in Holland, they normally, it's very common that they ask you about your condition. They don't offer you medicine, and they ask you to come back in a week because they have much less a drug culture. I think they give 50% of the medicine per person of what they would give in France, for example. Or I think it's probably also the case if you compare the UK and Holland. Doctors expect your illness usually to go away. So you do need to demand medicine if you want to get medicine from a doctor, which actually the doctor also expects you to do that. So that's a cultural learning curve.
To demand for the things.
Yeah, I want this, please. Don't hope that the doctor will look after you. The doctor will be expecting you to express your needs clearly.
Okay. Is that the same thing in business?
Yes, to some extent. I think directness is normal in the Dutch culture, and they will be irritated by, for example, the more English approach, which would be you would hope to be offered service, whereas in Holland you would expect your client to ask for what they want. I think that's where I would differ in my approach, because I'm usually trying to go deeper to get a sense of what is needed on a deeper level below the top of the iceberg.
Yeah.
So that would probably indicate how my approach as an individual would be different. Of course, there are other people who operate in that way here in Holland too.